Somewhere in the distant past, a civilization may have discovered something so important that its final survivors spent their last days trying to warn the future. A warning that crossed centuries. A warning that survived the fall of cities, the passing of generations, and the slow erosion of memory itself. But what was the warning? And why did history almost completely forget the people who tried to deliver it? Before we uncover this remarkable mystery, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Coding School. Here, we journey into the forgotten corners of human history, exploring ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and stories that time almost erased forever. And if these hidden chapters of the past fascinate you, you're in exactly the right place. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift gently into the ancient world. Because tonight, we are following the trail of a civilization that history nearly forgot. Not a civilization remembered for enormous empires. Not a civilization celebrated in countless books. Not a civilization whose name survived through thousands of years. Instead, this was a people whose memory faded so completely that history itself seemed to lose track of them. And yet from time to time, small traces still appear. A broken wall beneath desert sand. A strange symbol carved into weathered stone. A forgotten settlement hidden beneath layers of earth. Tiny fragments that seem to whisper the same quiet message. We were here. We learned something and we tried to tell you. The message was simple, at least it may have started that way. A community sees a change in the world around them. They notice the river behaving differently. They notice the seasons arriving at unusual times. They notice shorelines slowly moving. At first, these changes seem small. A little more water here, a little less water there. A slightly colder winter, a slightly warmer summer, nothing dramatic, nothing that would convince people that history itself was beginning to shift. But ancient people were often closer to nature than we are today. Their survival depended on observation. A farmer had to understand the rhythm of the seasons. A hunter had to recognize changes in animal behavior. A fisherman had to read the water. Small details mattered. And because small details mattered, patterns mattered too. Imagine living in a settlement beside a river. Your parents lived beside that river. Your grandparents lived beside that river. Their stories describe how the water behaved, where it flowed, when it flooded, when it became calm. Then one day you notice something strange. The old stories no longer match reality. The river is changing. At first, only a few people notice. Then more people begin to notice. Then everyone notices. And suddenly the question becomes impossible to ignore. Why is this happening? Today we have satellites, weather stations, scientific instruments, global climate records. Ancient communities had none of these things. What they had instead was patience, observation, memory, and generations of accumulated experience. Sometimes we underestimate how powerful those things can be. A person who spends an entire lifetime observing the same landscape learns things that cannot easily be written in books. They learn subtle changes, tiny signals, quiet warnings. And over thousands of years, many ancient cultures became experts at reading the natural world. The sky became a calendar, the stars became markers, the moon became a clock, nature itself became a teacher. As time passes slowly, let us move deeper into their world. Imagine a child sitting beside a fire many thousands of years ago. The night is quiet, the stars are bright. An elder begins telling a story. Perhaps the story describes a great flood. Perhaps it describes a journey. Perhaps it describes a distant homeland that no longer exists. To modern ears, it sounds like a legend. To the people listening, it may be something more. It may be history, not history written in books, history carried in memory. This is one of the great challenges when studying forgotten civilizations. Many ancient people left behind knowledge without leaving behind writing. And when writing does not survive, historians must search for clues elsewhere, in landscapes, in artifacts, architecture, in myths, in traditions. Sometimes the clues are frustratingly small, a collection of stones, a buried tool, a fragment of pottery, a pattern repeated across hundreds of miles. Each clue appears insignificant by itself, but together they begin forming a picture of people who were more connected, more organized, and more knowledgeable than we once believed. This realization has changed archaeology many times. Again and again, discoveries force researchers to rethink old assumptions. For generations, people imagined ancient societies as simple communities slowly stumbling toward civilization. The reality appears far more complex. Ancient people experimented, adapted, learned, invented, observed, and occasionally achieved remarkable things, things that later generations forgot. This is where our mystery becomes especially interesting, because some forgotten societies seem to have possessed an unusually deep awareness of environmental change. They paid attention, they watched carefully, and they remembered. Consider what happens when sea levels rise. For us, such a process sounds abstract, but for people living near ancient coastlines, it would have been personal. A beach disappears, a fishing area vanishes, a village relocates, a familiar landmark sinks beneath water, then another, and another. A single generation might witness dramatic transformation. A few generations could witness an entirely different coastline. Imagine trying to explain this to your grandchildren. Imagine telling them that far beyond the water lies land where your ancestors once walked, land they can no longer see, land they may never believe existed, yet you know it existed. Your parents knew it existed. Your grandparents knew it existed. The memory survives, and so you tell the story, generation after generation, century after century. The story changes slightly each time, but the memory remains alive. Perhaps this is how some ancient warnings survived, not through monuments, not through books, but through storytelling. Stories became vessels, containers carrying knowledge across time. The details changed. The lesson remained: be aware, watch the world, things can change. This lesson appears again and again throughout history. Entire civilizations flourished because they understood their environment. Entire civilizations struggled when conditions shifted. Water moved, climate changed, trade routes disappeared, resources became scarce. Human history is filled with examples of adaptation. And adaptation often determines survival. Now let us imagine another scene. A settlement sits beside fertile land. Fields stretch toward the horizon. Families work together. Children play. Animals graze peacefully. Life appears stable. Yet beneath the surface, pressures are building. Rainfall patterns shift. Harvests become less predictable. Resources become harder to manage. Nothing collapses overnight. History rarely works that way. Most transformations happen gradually. One difficult year becomes two. Two become five. Five become 20. People adapt. They move. They experiment. They search for solutions. Some succeed. Others do not. This slow process is often invisible when we look backward. We see the beginning. We see the end. But we miss the generations caught in between. the people who experienced uncertainty in real time, the people who tried to understand what was happening, the people who may have recognized dangers before anyone else. These are often the voices history forgets, the survivors, the observers, the messengers, and yet they may be the most important people in the entire story, because they are the ones who carry knowledge forward. As centuries pass, some communities become centers of learning, knowledge accumulates, agricultural techniques improve, construction methods evolve, navigation becomes more sophisticated, astronomical observations become increasingly accurate. Little by little, human understanding grows. But knowledge is fragile, far more fragile than we like to imagine. A library can burn, a city can fall, a language can disappear, an empire can collapse, and suddenly generations of accumulated wisdom become difficult to recover. This is one reason forgotten civilizations fascinate us. They remind us that history is incomplete. For every surviving document, countless others vanished. For every famous city, many disappeared. For every well-known civilization, others remain hidden beneath soil, forests, deserts, and oceans. Sometimes the missing pieces seem almost within reach. Researchers discover evidence suggesting that ancient trade networks connected distant peoples. Ideas traveled, goods traveled, stories traveled, knowledge traveled. The ancient world may have been far more interconnected than earlier historians imagined. And if ideas traveled widely, warnings may have traveled as well. This possibility raises another quiet question. What exactly were people trying to preserve? What knowledge mattered so much that it survived through stories, traditions, and generations of memory? One answer may be surprisingly simple: the understanding that human beings are never separate from nature. We depend upon it. We adapt to it. We are shaped by it. Ancient communities understood this reality every day. A failed harvest was not merely inconvenient, it could threaten survival. A changing river was not just an interesting observation, it could transform an entire region. Environmental awareness was not an academic subject, it was life itself. And because it was life itself, people paid attention, perhaps more attention than we often realize. Imagine standing on a shoreline thousands of years ago. The ocean stretches before you. The sun slowly rises. Waves move gently across the sand. Everything appears peaceful. Yet year after year, the water advances. Slowly, patiently, relentlessly. Most visitors would never notice, but someone who lives there notices. Someone who watches every season notices. Someone whose family has lived there for generations notices. And eventually they begin telling others, the shoreline is changing. The world is changing. Pay attention. Remember. Do not forget. Those words may never have been written, yet they may have echoed through countless generations. And perhaps that is why traces of similar stories appear in so many different places. Not because every story describes exactly the same event, but because many communities experience the same reality: change, loss, adaptation, survival. The themes repeat because the experience repeats. Human beings encounter challenge. Human beings learn. Human beings remember. Then they try to pass that knowledge forward, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And this brings us closer to the civilization history forgot. Because the people we are searching for may not have left behind a single warning. They may have left behind hundreds of warnings, scattered across myths, buried beneath archaeological sites, hidden inside traditions, preserved in fragments. each fragment incomplete, each fragment mysterious. Yet together they form something remarkable, a picture of ancient humanity trying to understand a changing world, a picture of people who recognized patterns, who observed nature carefully, who attempted to preserve what they learned, and who may have hoped that future generations would listen. But this raises another quiet question. What happened when future generations stopped listening? Because as our journey continues, we will begin to encounter evidence that some warnings survived long after the civilizations themselves disappeared. And in some cases, those warnings may still be relevant today. The strange thing about forgotten civilizations is that they rarely disappear all at once. When we imagine the fall of an ancient society, we often picture a single dramatic moment, a city burning, a kingdom collapsing, a ruler falling from power, but reality is usually much quieter. A family leaves its home and moves somewhere else. A village becomes smaller. A trade route grows less active. A language is spoken by fewer children each year. A tradition slowly fades, then another, and another. Until one day, centuries later, historians look back and realize an entire world has vanished, not with a loud ending, but with a long silence. As time passes slowly, let us imagine one such world. Far from the great capitals that would later dominate history, there are communities living close to rivers, coastlines, forests, and open plains. They know the land intimately. They understand where water gathers after storms. They understand which plants survive difficult seasons. They understand animal migrations. The landscape is not merely a place where they live. It is a living source of knowledge. Every hill, every stream, every valley carries meaning. Knowledge is passed from generation to generation, not in books, not in libraries, but in memory. A child learns by walking beside an elder. A young hunter learns by observing. A farmer learns through seasons of success and failure. Knowledge lives inside people. This system works remarkably well. For centuries, sometimes for thousands of years, but it contains a hidden weakness. If enough people disappear, the knowledge disappears with them. A written document can survive its author. A story carried only in memory cannot. And perhaps this is exactly what happened to many forgotten civilizations. Their greatest achievements may never have been written down. Their most valuable discoveries may never have been carved into stone. Their wisdom may have lived entirely within human memory, which means much of it vanished when they vanished. This possibility changes how we think about history, because suddenly the past becomes larger, much larger. We begin realizing that archaeology does not reveal everything. The artifacts we discover are only fragments, tiny pieces of much bigger stories. Imagine finding a single page from a lost book. You might learn something, but you would never know the entire story. Now imagine that most ancient civilizations left behind only a few pages. Some left behind only a sentence. Others left behind a single word, and many left behind nothing at all. This is the challenge historians face. They are trying to reconstruct entire worlds from scattered clues. Sometimes those clues lead somewhere unexpected. One of the most fascinating discoveries in recent decades is how often ancient people seem to have understood their environments in sophisticated ways. For a long time, modern society tended to underestimate prehistoric communities. The assumption was simple. Without modern technology, ancient people must have known less. Yet discovery after discovery suggests a more complicated reality. They may not have possessed modern machines, but many possessed deep environmental knowledge, knowledge built through observation over countless generations. Imagine watching the same river for 500 years, not personally, of course, but through parents, grandparents, and ancestors. Each generation adds observations. Each generation contributes memory. Eventually, patterns emerge that no single lifetime could reveal. Flood cycles become understood. Seasonal changes become predictable. Long-term trends become visible. In a sense, entire communities become living archives, and living archives can sometimes notice things others miss. This idea becomes especially important when we examine some of the world's oldest traditions. Across different continents, cultures preserved stories about environmental transformation, stories of rising waters, stories of migration, stories of changing landscapes, stories of survival. The details vary enormously, yet certain themes appear again and again. Something changed, people adapted, knowledge mattered, memory mattered, forgetting carried consequences. Perhaps this is why so many ancient traditions place such importance on elders. Elders were not merely older people. They were libraries, living libraries. They carried generations of accumulated experience. They remembered droughts, floods, migrations, successes, failures. They remembered things younger generations had never seen, and because they remembered, they could warn others. This may have been one of humanity's earliest forms of long-term planning, not technology, not writing, memory, the ability to preserve lessons across generations, the ability to learn from experiences you never personally witnessed, the ability to prepare for challenges before they arrive. Even today, this remains one of our greatest strengths as a species. We inherit knowledge from people who came before us. Without that inheritance, civilization becomes impossible. Now imagine what happens when that chain breaks. Imagine communities scattered by disaster. Imagine migrations disrupting traditions. Imagine languages disappearing. Imagine elders dying before knowledge can be passed forward. Suddenly, entire archives vanish. Not physical archives, human archives. And perhaps this happened many times throughout history, far more often than we realize. Now let us move a little deeper into our mystery. Archaeologists occasionally discover settlements in surprising places, beneath modern cities, beneath forests, beneath deserts, sometimes even beneath water. These discoveries remind us of an uncomfortable fact. The map of the ancient world is incomplete. There are places we know existed but have not found. There are places we may never find. Entire chapters of human history remain hidden. One reason is simple. The Earth itself is constantly changing. Coastlines shift. Rivers move. Forests expand. Deserts grow. Volcanoes erupt. Earthquakes reshape landscapes. Given enough time, nature becomes remarkably effective at hiding the past. Imagine a thriving settlement near an ancient coastline 10,000 years ago. Generations live there. Children are born there. Stories are told there. Knowledge is shared there. Then sea levels rise, slowly, year after year, century after century. Eventually, the settlement disappears beneath water, the people relocate, their descendants move elsewhere, the memory survives for a while, then gradually fades. Thousands of years later, the settlement rests beneath the sea, invisible, forgotten, waiting. The thought is astonishing. How many stories remain hidden beneath oceans today? How many forgotten communities lie beneath waters that once covered dry land? No one knows, And that uncertainty keeps the mystery alive, because every discovery reveals how much remains undiscovered. Every answer creates new questions. This pattern appears throughout the study of ancient civilizations. Researchers solve one puzzle, three new puzzles appear, a structure is uncovered, its purpose remains uncertain, an artifact is found, its meaning remains debated, a settlement emerges, its story remains incomplete. History is less like a finished book and more like an enormous puzzle with missing pieces. Some pieces fit together, others remain lost. Yet even incomplete puzzles reveal fascinating images, and one image appears repeatedly. Human beings have always been observers, careful observers, patient observers, observers who notice details. This ability may explain why some ancient communities survived extraordinary challenges. When environments changed, they adapted. When resources shifted, they adjusted. When circumstances evolved, they learned. Adaptation became a form of intelligence, not intelligence measured through machines or inventions. Intelligence measured through survival, measured through resilience, measured through understanding. And perhaps this is what the forgotten civilization wanted future generations to remember. Not a specific warning, not a single prediction, but a way of thinking. Observe, pay attention, adapt, learn, remember. Simple ideas, yet powerful ones, because civilizations often struggle when they stop observing change. History provides countless examples. A society assumes conditions will remain stable, then conditions shift. A community ignores warning signs, then consequences arrive. A culture forgets lessons learned by earlier generations, then old mistakes return. The pattern repeats, again and again. This is one reason ancient stories remain relevant. Even when details become uncertain, the lessons often survive. Pay attention, prepare, respect nature, value knowledge, listen to experience. These messages appear in traditions across the world, different words, different cultures, similar themes, and perhaps that similarity is not accidental. Perhaps many ancient societies reached similar conclusions through observation. When people live close to nature long enough, they begin noticing the same truths. Water matters, climate matters, resources matter, cooperation matters, memory matters. Without these things, survival becomes more difficult. With them, communities flourish. Now imagine a group of survivors living through profound change. Perhaps coastlines are shifting. Perhaps weather patterns are becoming unpredictable. Perhaps familiar landscapes are disappearing. They know something important, something learned through experience, something future generations need to understand. How do they preserve it? Today we might write a report, store data, upload information. Ancient people had different tools, stories, songs, ceremonies, symbols, traditions. These became vessels for memory. And because they became vessels for memory, they often survived surprisingly long periods of time, sometimes longer than buildings, longer than governments, longer than cities. A story can travel across centuries, across continents, across civilizations. A story can survive where monuments fail. Perhaps that is why ancient warnings often arrive wrapped in myth. The myth keeps the memory alive, even when people forget exactly what the memory originally described. And so, thousands of years later, we inherit fragments, a flood story here, a migration story there, a warning hidden inside a legend, a lesson preserved through ritual. Individually, they appear disconnected. Together, they hint at something larger, a vast network of human memory stretching deep into prehistory, a memory created by people history rarely remembers. People without famous names, people without monuments, people without surviving books, yet people whose observations may have influenced generations that followed. And the more we examine these forgotten voices, the more another possibility begins to emerge. What if the civilization history forgot was not forgotten because it lacked importance? What if it was forgotten because it existed before later civilizations learned how to record history properly? What if its knowledge survived only as echoes? Echoes scattered across myths, traditions, and cultural memory. Echoes that still surround us today. And if that is true, then our search is only beginning. Because somewhere within those echoes may be clues about one of humanity's oldest lessons. A lesson carried forward by survivors who understood that the world can change faster than we expect. A lesson they desperately hoped future generations would never forget. If those survivors truly existed, they faced a challenge that every generation faces in one form or another. How do you convince people to prepare for something they cannot yet see? It is a surprisingly difficult problem. Even today, people often pay attention only when change becomes impossible to ignore. But ancient observers may have understood something important. By the time everyone notices a problem, valuable time has already been lost. So they watched carefully. They remembered. And they shared what they learned. Let us imagine one of those communities. Not a mighty empire, not a famous kingdom, just a settlement near the edge of a changing world. The people wake with the sun. They gather water, they tend crops, they repair homes. Children run along pathways worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Life appears ordinary, comfortably familiar. Yet beneath that familiar routine, subtle changes continue. A shoreline sits farther inland than it once did. Storms arrive differently. Animal migrations become less predictable. Plants that once thrived begin struggling. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, just enough to concern the people who pay attention. And often throughout history, it is a small number of observers who notice change first. The majority continues daily life. The observers watch. The observers compare present conditions to memory. The observers ask questions. Why is this happening? What does it mean? Will it continue? These questions are among the oldest questions human beings have ever asked. Because understanding change means understanding the future. And understanding the future improves the chances of survival. This pursuit of understanding may have shaped many ancient cultures far more than we realize. Modern people often separate science, history, tradition, and spirituality into different categories. Ancient societies frequently blended them together. Observation mixed with storytelling. Knowledge mixed with ritual, practical lessons mixed with cultural identity. The result was a system capable of preserving information across generations, not always perfectly, but often surprisingly effectively. Imagine teaching children about dangerous floods. You could simply explain the facts, or you could tell a memorable story. A story survives more easily. A story travels farther. A story captures attention. For thousands of years, stories became humanity's storage system. A living storage system carried in minds rather than machines. This idea becomes increasingly fascinating when we examine ancient myths from around the world. Many contain layers. On the surface, they entertain. Beneath that, they teach. Beneath that, they preserve memory. And beneath that, they sometimes contain observations about the natural world. The challenge is determining which memories reflect real experiences and which serve symbolic purposes. The answer is often complicated. Sometimes both are true. A story can preserve practical knowledge while also carrying deeper cultural meaning. This complexity makes ancient traditions extraordinarily valuable, not because they provide perfect historical records, but because they offer glimpses into how people understood their world. And understanding how people understood their world is one of the keys to understanding history itself. As time passes slowly, let us move further into another aspect of our mystery. Consider the remarkable patience required to build knowledge over many generations. Today, information travels instantly. A discovery made in one part of the world can reach another part within seconds. Ancient communities operated differently. Knowledge moved at the speed of people. A traveler carried information. A trader carried information. A storyteller carried information. A migration carried information. This slower pace may seem limiting, yet it also encouraged careful observation. People spent years, decades, even lifetimes studying the same environments. They developed intimate relationships with landscapes. A forest was not merely a collection of trees, it was a source of knowledge. A river was not merely water, it was a teacher. The sky was not merely scenery, it was a guide. Many ancient societies developed detailed understanding of seasonal cycles. They tracked the movements of celestial objects. They observed weather patterns. They recognized environmental signals. In some cases, their observations were astonishingly accurate. This realization continues surprising researchers today. The deeper we explore the past, the more evidence we find of sophisticated thinking. Not modern thinking, but sophisticated thinking adapted to ancient circumstances. And this distinction matters. Ancient people were not trying to build modern civilization. They were trying to solve the problems facing their own world. Sometimes their solutions appear unfamiliar because their challenges were different. Yet the intelligence behind those solutions remains impressive. Now imagine what happens when such knowledge accumulates for centuries. Generation after generation contributes observations. Patterns emerge. Lessons become refined. Traditions become repositories of experience. Over time, a community develops something precious. Collective wisdom. Collective wisdom is difficult to measure. It does not exist in a single object. It cannot always be excavated. It leaves few physical traces. Yet it may be one of the most valuable resources any civilization possesses, because collective wisdom helps people respond to uncertainty, and uncertainty has always been part of human history. No civilization, however powerful, escapes uncertainty forever. Weather changes, resources shift, neighbors move, technologies evolve, new opportunities appear, new risks emerge. Successful societies adapt, unsuccessful societies struggle. This pattern repeats across centuries, again and again, which brings us back to the forgotten civilization. Perhaps their greatest achievement was not a monument, perhaps it was not architecture, perhaps it was not technology, perhaps it was awareness. Awareness of change, awareness of patterns, awareness of long-term consequences. Such awareness rarely attracts attention. Monuments attract attention. Treasures attract attention. Empires attract attention, but Awareness often remains invisible until it proves important, and by then the people who developed it may already be gone. This possibility transforms the way we think about historical importance. A civilization does not need giant structures to influence the future. Sometimes influence travels through ideas, through observations, through lessons, through memory. The most important legacy may be something impossible to touch. Now let us imagine a traveler many thousands of years ago. The traveler moves between distant communities. Along the way, stories are exchanged, news is exchanged, knowledge is exchanged. The traveler notices similarities. Different groups tell related stories. Different regions remember similar events. Different cultures preserve comparable warnings. The details vary. The themes remain. Something changed. People adapted. Knowledge mattered. Remembering mattered. These repeated themes create an intriguing possibility. Perhaps ancient communities shared more information than we once believed. Perhaps ideas traveled farther than expected. Perhaps networks of communication existed long before formal empires connected vast territories. Evidence increasingly suggests this may be true. Even in deep prehistory, people exchanged goods across impressive distances. Materials moved, techniques moved, ideas moved. Human beings have always been connected by curiosity, and where curiosity travels, knowledge often follows. This helps explain why certain patterns appear repeatedly throughout human history. Communities separated by great distances sometimes reach similar conclusions, not because they directly copied one another, but because they observed similar realities. The environment rewards attention, nature rewards observation, experience rewards memory. These lessons are universal. Ancient people discovered them again and again. And perhaps this is why the warnings of forgotten civilizations continue echoing through time. The warnings were not limited to one location. They reflected broader truths, truths that remain relevant regardless of geography. Pay attention, observe carefully, learn from the past, prepare for change. Simple ideas, yet ideas powerful enough to survive thousands of years. As our journey continues, another fascinating question begins to emerge. If ancient societies possessed valuable knowledge, how much has been lost? The answer may be difficult to hear, probably far more than we realize. Consider all the fragile things history depends upon. Wood decays, paper burns, fabric rots, buildings collapse, languages disappear. Every generation inherits only a fraction of what came before. Most information vanishes. Most stories vanish. Most names vanish. History, in many ways, is built from survivors, surviving artifacts, surviving documents, surviving traditions, surviving memories. The vast majority of human experience disappears, yet even the surviving fragments reveal extraordinary things. They reveal creativity, adaptation, resilience, curiosity, and perhaps most importantly, they reveal continuity. Despite enormous differences between ancient people and modern people, certain qualities remain remarkably familiar. Ancient parents worried about their children. Ancient communities planned for the future. Ancient observers tried to understand the world. Ancient storytellers preserved lessons. In many ways, they were not so different from us. This realization changes how we view the forgotten civilization. It becomes less mysterious and more human. These were not mythical figures. They were people facing uncertainty, people making decisions, people trying to leave something valuable behind, people hoping future generations might listen. Whether future generations listened successfully is another question entirely, because history suggests that human beings often learn lessons, forget lessons, and then learn them again. The cycle repeats endlessly. Knowledge accumulates, knowledge fades, knowledge returns. Perhaps this cycle itself is part of the warning. Perhaps the forgotten civilization understood something fundamental, not merely that change occurs. Everyone knows change occurs. The deeper lesson may be that memory matters. Without memory, societies repeat mistakes. Without memory, valuable observations disappear. Without memory, hard-earned wisdom is lost. This is why stories remain important. Stories preserve memory. Stories bridge generations. Stories carry experiences beyond individual lifetimes. And sometimes stories become the last surviving connection to worlds that no longer exist. Worlds hidden beneath forests. Worlds hidden beneath deserts. Worlds hidden beneath oceans. Worlds history almost forgot, yet not completely, because every discovery, every legend, every fragment of evidence continues pointing toward the same possibility. Somewhere in the distant past, people noticed things worth remembering. They tried to preserve those observations. They tried to pass them forward. And across thousands of years, faint echoes of their message still remain. But the deeper we follow those echoes, the stranger the mystery becomes. Because there are places around the world where ancient knowledge seems to have survived in unexpected ways. Places where memories endured long after the civilizations themselves disappeared. Places that may hold some of the strongest clues, yet about what those last survivors were truly trying to tell the future. There are certain places in the world where time feels different. Places where the past never seems entirely gone. A traveler arrives expecting ruins, but what they find instead is memory. Memory hidden inside traditions. Memory hidden inside stories. Memory hidden inside habits that have survived for generations. Sometimes these traditions are so old that nobody remembers exactly where they began. People simply continue them because their ancestors did the same. A story is told. A ceremony is repeated. A warning is remembered. And somewhere inside that tradition, a fragment of the ancient world remains alive. This is one of the reasons historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists pay close attention to cultural memory. Objects can tell us what people made. Buildings can tell us how people lived. But traditions can sometimes tell us how people thought. And understanding how people thought may be one of the most important parts of understanding history. Imagine discovering the remains of a settlement. You might learn where homes stood. You might learn what people ate. You might learn how they built structures, but understanding what they believed, understanding what they feared, understanding what they hoped for, that is much harder. Yet those invisible things often shape history just as much as physical objects, perhaps even more. Now let us imagine a coastal community many thousands of years ago. The sea stretches endlessly toward the horizon. Fishing boats move across calm water. Children play along the shoreline. Life appears peaceful. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, knowledge is being passed from one generation to the next. An elder teaches younger people where the water once reached. The younger generation looks confused. The place being described is now underwater. The elder points toward the sea. Out there, beyond the waves, that is where the old land used to be. At first, the story sounds impossible, but the elder insists. The land existed, people lived there, families walked there. Then the water came, slowly, year after year, generation after generation. The shoreline changed, the world changed, and eventually the land disappeared. To modern ears, such a story might sound like folklore. Yet in some cases, researchers have discovered remarkable examples where traditional stories appear to preserve genuine memories of ancient environmental changes. This possibility is astonishing. Imagine a memory surviving not for decades, not for centuries, but for thousands of years, passed carefully from one generation to another, preserved through storytelling, preserved through culture, preserved through repetition. If such memories can survive that long, then the past may be speaking to us in ways we do not always recognize. And perhaps this is where we begin to glimpse the true legacy of forgotten civilizations, not through monuments, not through treasure, but through memory itself. As time passes slowly, let us move deeper into this idea. Modern society often treats information as something stored in devices. Ancient societies stored information differently. The community became the archive. The people became the archive. Knowledge survived because people actively remembered it. This approach had advantages. Information remained connected to daily life. Knowledge remained practical. Lessons remained relevant, but it also carried risks. If enough people disappeared, the archive disappeared. And history contains many moments when exactly that happened. Disease, migration, conflict, environmental change. Countless forces disrupted ancient communities. When communities vanished, their knowledge often vanished too, or at least most of it did. Yet not everything disappeared. Fragments survived, a story survived, a tradition survived, a warning survived. And sometimes those fragments traveled astonishing distances through time. Consider how many ancient stories involve respect for nature, respect for rivers, respect for mountains, respect for forests, respect for the sea. Modern people occasionally interpret these traditions as purely symbolic, but there may have been practical wisdom hidden inside them. Communities that respected environmental limits often survived longer. Communities that ignored them often faced difficulties. Over time, experience became tradition. Tradition became culture. Culture became memory. And memory became survival. Perhaps this is one of the great lessons forgotten civilizations attempted to pass forward. Human beings are not separate from their environment. We are participants within it. Ancient people understood this reality every day. They could not afford to forget it. Now imagine a civilization that spends generations observing environmental change. Generation after generation notices patterns. Water levels fluctuate, resources shift, weather behaves differently. The community responds, adjusts, learns. Over centuries, they develop a body of knowledge, not written knowledge, living knowledge. Then something happens. Perhaps migration scatters the population. Perhaps changing conditions force relocation. Perhaps the culture transforms into something new. Whatever the cause, the original civilization gradually disappears, but pieces of its knowledge survive. The descendants continue telling certain stories. Certain lessons remain important. Certain warnings remain repeated. Over time, the original context becomes less clear. The stories evolve, yet the core message remains: observe, adapt. Remember, these three ideas appear repeatedly throughout human history, and perhaps they form the heart of our mystery. Because when historians search for lost civilizations, they often search for physical evidence. Walls, roads, temples, artifacts. Yet some of the most important legacies leave few physical traces. A useful idea leaves no fossil. A valuable lesson leaves no skeleton. A tradition leaves little evidence for archaeologists to excavate. And yet such things can influence generations, perhaps even entire civilizations. This possibility forces us to reconsider what it means for a civilization to survive. Must a civilization survive physically? Must its cities remain standing? Must its language continue? Or can a civilization survive through the knowledge it passes forward? If a lesson survives, if an observation survives, if a warning survives, has something of that civilization survived as well? The answer may be yes. And if so, forgotten civilizations may not be as forgotten as we think. Their names may be gone, their buildings may be gone, yet their influence may still surround us, hidden within traditions, hidden within stories, hidden within ways of understanding the world. Now let us move a little deeper into another fascinating clue. Throughout history, many societies developed methods for tracking time. This was not merely curiosity, it was necessity. Knowing when rains would arrive mattered. Knowing when rivers flooded mattered. Knowing when seasons changed mattered. Agriculture depended upon timing. Travel depended upon timing. Survival depended upon timing. As a result, ancient observers became careful students of natural cycles. They watched the sun. They watched the moon. They watched the stars, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. Their observations accumulated. Patterns became predictable. Calendars emerged. Systems emerged. Knowledge emerged. What makes this remarkable is that many ancient systems achieved impressive accuracy. Without telescopes, without computers, without modern instruments, only patience, observation, and memory. This tells us something important about forgotten civilizations. They were not passive participants in history. They were active investigators of the world around them. They asked questions. They searched for patterns. They developed explanations. In many ways, they were pursuing the same goals humans pursue today. Understanding, prediction, preparation. The tools differed. The curiosity remained. And curiosity may be one of humanity's oldest traditions. Long before writing, long before cities, long before empire, people looked at the world and asked why. Why do seasons change? Why do rivers flood? Why do stars move? Why does the landscape transform? Those questions drove observation. Observation produced knowledge. Knowledge produced survival. And survival allowed cultures to continue. At least for a while. Because eventually every civilization encounters uncertainty. No society remains unchanged forever. The forgotten civilization was no exception. At some point, conditions shifted, challenges emerged, decisions became necessary. And here we arrive at one of the most intriguing possibilities in our story. What if the final survivors recognized what was happening before everyone else? What if they saw warning signs that others ignored? History contains many examples of this phenomenon. A few observers notice changes. Most people continue daily life. The observers become concerned. The majority remains unconvinced. Only later does the significance become obvious. If something similar happened in the distant past, the final survivors may have carried a burden few others understood. They saw patterns. They recognized risks. They tried to preserve knowledge. and perhaps they hoped future generations would benefit from what they had learned. Whether that hope succeeded remains uncertain, but traces of their efforts may still survive, not in a single location, not in a single culture, but scattered across human memory itself, fragments waiting to be recognized, fragments waiting to be connected, fragments suggesting that history's forgotten civilizations may have been trying to tell us something far more important than their own story. They may have been trying to teach us how to survive change, and as we continue following their trail, we will begin discovering evidence that this lesson appeared again and again across different parts of the ancient world. Different people, different places, different centuries, yet remarkably similar warnings. A pattern so widespread that it becomes difficult to ignore. And once we begin seeing that pattern, the mystery grows even deeper. The deeper we travel into the ancient world, the more we begin to notice something unusual. The same lessons appear again and again, not always in the same words, not always in the same stories, but hidden beneath different traditions, different cultures, and different landscapes, familiar ideas continue to surface. Respect the natural world. Pay attention to change. Remember the lessons of the past. Prepare for the future. At first, this may not seem surprising. After all, these are useful ideas. Any society that survives for a long period of time is likely to discover them. Yet the repetition itself is fascinating, because it suggests that many different groups of people, separated by great distances and vast stretches of time, arrived at similar conclusions. And when that happens, historians pay attention, not because repetition proves anything by itself, but because repetition often points toward something important. Imagine hearing the same warning from hundreds of different voices. Each voice tells a slightly different story. Each voice comes from a different place, yet all of them point in roughly the same direction. Eventually, you begin to wonder whether they are describing different versions of the same experience. Perhaps that experience was one of the defining experiences of early human history, living through change, adapting to change, learning from change, and trying to ensure future generations would be ready when change arrived again. Now let us imagine a world without modern maps, without satellites, without weather forecasts, without global communication. For ancient communities, knowledge about the wider world arrived slowly, very slowly. Sometimes information traveled only as fast as a person could walk. A traveler might bring news from distant lands. A merchant might describe conditions elsewhere. A storyteller might carry memories across generations. In this world, information was precious, and information about change was especially valuable. Imagine hearing that rivers in another region were behaving differently. Imagine hearing that crops were failing in distant territories. Imagine hearing that entire groups of people were moving in search of better conditions. Such information could influence decisions. It could shape migrations. It could determine survival. Ancient people understood this, which is why memory held such importance. A remembered lesson could save lives. A forgotten lesson could carry consequences. Perhaps this explains why certain stories were preserved so carefully, not because they were entertaining, not because they were sacred alone, but because they contained useful knowledge, knowledge disguised as narrative, knowledge disguised as tradition, knowledge disguised as myth. The disguise helped the knowledge survive, because stories are easier to remember than facts. Even today, people often remember stories long after they forget statistics. Stories engage emotion. Stories create images. Stories connect ideas. Ancient cultures understood this instinctively. They used stories as vessels, and through those vessels, information traveled across centuries. As time passes slowly, let us move further into one of history's greatest mysteries. What happened to all the knowledge that did not survive? This question may seem impossible to answer, yet it is worth considering. Every civilization loses information. Even modern societies lose information. Documents disappear. Languages evolve. Records are destroyed. Memories fade. If information can disappear today despite modern technology, imagine how much vanished during prehistory. Entire traditions may be gone. Entire systems of understanding may be gone. Entire observations may be gone, not because they lacked value, simply because survival is never guaranteed. This realization can feel almost overwhelming. The amount of lost human experience may be far greater than the amount that survived. Think of all the conversations that were never recorded, all the discoveries that were never written down, all the insights that existed only within individual minds. Most vanished forever, yet some did survive. And those surviving fragments allow us to glimpse extraordinary possibilities. For example, many ancient communities appear to have developed sophisticated understanding of local environments. They knew where water could be found. They knew which plants were useful. They knew how weather patterns behaved. They knew how landscapes responded to change. This knowledge was practical, immediate, essential, and often deeply detailed. In some cases, modern researchers continue learning from traditional knowledge preserved by indigenous communities around the world. This does not mean ancient people knew everything, far from it, but it reminds us that knowledge takes many forms. Modern science is powerful. Ancient observation was powerful too. The two approaches are different, yet both begin with the same act, paying attention. And perhaps that simple act lies at the heart of our forgotten civilization. Perhaps their greatest strength was not wealth, not military power, not architecture, but observation, the willingness to notice patterns others overlooked. Imagine living in a community where generations carefully record seasonal changes through memory. Children learn what their grandparents learned. Grandparents share what their own grandparents taught them. The chain stretches backward across centuries. Every generation adds another link. Eventually, the community possesses a remarkably long view of environmental change, longer than any individual lifetime, longer than any single observer could achieve alone. This collective perspective may have allowed ancient societies to notice trends invisible to outsiders. And if they notice such trends, they may have attempted to preserve that knowledge, not merely for themselves, but for descendants, for future communities, for people they would never meet. There is something deeply human about that idea. People planting trees whose shade they will never enjoy. People preserving stories for generations not yet born. People creating knowledge intended for the future. Human history contains countless examples of such generosity, and perhaps our forgotten civilization participated in that tradition. Perhaps they understood that knowledge becomes most valuable when shared. Now let us imagine another scene. A gathering takes place beneath the night sky. The stars stretch across the darkness. Children sit quietly. Adults listen. An elder begins speaking. The story is old, very old, older than anyone present. The elder learned it from earlier generations. Those generations learned it from earlier generations still. The chain continues backward into a past nobody can fully remember, yet the story remains alive. As the elder speaks, listeners hear more than entertainment. They hear memory, they hear identity, they hear lessons preserved through time. And perhaps somewhere within that story lies a warning, not an urgent warning, not a frightening warning, a patient warning, the kind of warning nature gives, the kind that unfolds slowly, the kind that rewards attention. The story reminds listeners that landscapes change, seas move, rivers shift, conditions evolve. The world is never entirely still. People must remain observant, flexible, prepared. Generation after generation hears the message. Generation after generation passes it forward. This process may have repeated countless times throughout history, across continents, across cultures, across millennia, different stories, similar lessons. And that similarity becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, because eventually we begin asking a larger question. What if the forgotten civilization was not a single civilization at all? What if it was something broader? What if it was a network of human experiences shared across the ancient world? A vast collection of communities learning similar lessons from similar challenges. Communities connected not by political borders but by observation, by adaptation, by memory. This possibility changes everything. Instead of searching for one lost city, we begin searching for a lost way of understanding the world. A worldview shaped by close attention to nature. A worldview built over generations. A worldview that valued memory as much as innovation. And perhaps that worldview influenced more of human history than we realize. The evidence remains incomplete, fragments only. Yet the fragments point toward something intriguing. Ancient people may have possessed forms of knowledge that modern societies sometimes overlook. Not superior knowledge, different knowledge. Knowledge developed through intimate connection with local environments. Knowledge developed through long-term observation. Knowledge preserved through culture. This perspective does not diminish modern achievements. Rather, it expands our appreciation for human intelligence across time. The past becomes richer, more complex, more impressive. And as it becomes richer, the forgotten civilization becomes more interesting. Because perhaps history did not forget them entirely. Perhaps history simply misunderstood where to look. Maybe the true legacy was never hidden inside monuments. Maybe it was hidden inside memory, inside traditions, inside stories repeated beside countless fires beneath countless stars. Stories that carried observations forward when nothing else could. Stories that survived because people cared enough to remember. And if that is true, then the final survivors achieved something remarkable. Even if their cities vanished, even if their names disappeared, even if their civilization faded, their message endured, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough for echoes to survive, enough for clues to remain, enough for future generations to continue asking questions. And those questions are leading us toward one of the most fascinating parts of our journey. Because the closer we look at the ancient world, the more evidence we find that some forgotten communities understood a truth that remains relevant even now. A truth about resilience, a truth about adaptation, a truth about the relationship between memory and survival. And that truth may be the closest thing we have to the warning their last survivors were trying to leave behind. If there is one word that quietly follows us through the entire story of humanity, it is resilience. Not strength, not power, not wealth. Resilience. The ability to continue, the ability to adapt, the ability to learn when circumstances change. Again and again, history shows us that resilience often matters more than greatness. Many powerful kingdoms disappeared. Many wealthy cities vanished. Many famous rulers were forgotten. Yet communities that learned how to adapt often survived far longer than anyone expected. Perhaps this was one of the deepest lessons understood by the civilization history forgot. Because when we look carefully at the ancient world, we find that survival rarely belonged to the strongest alone. Survival often belonged to the most observant, the most flexible, the most willing to change when conditions demanded it. This lesson appears repeatedly throughout archaeology. A landscape changes, a river shifts course, rainfall patterns become unpredictable, resources move elsewhere. Some groups continue using old solutions, others experiment, adjust, adapt. The difference between those responses can shape generations. Now imagine standing beside a river thousands of years ago. The river has always been reliable. It has always provided water, food, transportation, life. Generations have depended upon it. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, conditions begin changing. The river behaves differently. Its floods arrive at unusual times. Its channels move. Its patterns become less predictable. At first, people assume things will return to normal. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do not. The communities that survive longest are often the ones willing to observe reality rather than cling to expectations. This sounds simple, yet it may be one of the hardest things human beings ever do. Throughout history, people have preferred familiar answers, familiar habits, familiar assumptions. Change can be uncomfortable. Uncertainty can be frightening. Yet reality continues changing whether people acknowledge it or not. Ancient observers understood this. Nature taught the lesson repeatedly. Seasons changed, landscapes changed, conditions changed, and successful communities learned to change alongside them. As time passes slowly, let us move deeper into another remarkable aspect of the ancient world. One thing that often surprises modern researchers is how interconnected ancient knowledge may have been. For a long time, people imagined prehistoric communities as isolated groups with limited contact. Increasingly, evidence suggests a more connected reality. Materials traveled impressive distances. Ideas traveled impressive distances. Techniques traveled impressive distances. Long before global communication networks existed, human beings were already sharing information. Not instantly, not efficiently by modern standards, but consistently. A traveler carried news. A trader carried ideas. A migrating family carried traditions. Knowledge moved because people moved. This movement created something extraordinary, a vast human network stretching across regions and generations. No single person could see the entire network, yet the network existed, and through that network observations spread. A useful farming method spread, a navigation technique spread, a warning spread, a story spread. Sometimes these stories changed as they traveled, details shifted, names changed, locations evolved. Yet certain themes remained surprisingly stable. This is why similar patterns appear across distant cultures, not because every community shared identical experiences, but because many communities faced similar challenges. And similar challenges often produce similar lessons. Observe carefully, prepare for uncertainty, respect nature, value memory, teach the next generation. These lessons appear again and again, like echoes moving through time. Now imagine the final generations of a fading civilization. They know their world is changing. Perhaps resources are becoming scarce. Perhaps migration has begun. Perhaps familiar traditions are becoming difficult to maintain. Perhaps younger generations are moving elsewhere. The elders understand something important. The future will belong to people they will never meet, people living in different places, people speaking different languages, people facing different challenges. How do they help those future generations? They do what humans have always done. They tell stories. They share lessons. They preserve memories, not because they know exactly what the future will bring, but because they understand that knowledge remains valuable, even when circumstances change, especially when circumstances change. There is something profoundly hopeful about this. The final survivors are not merely looking backward, they are looking forward. They are thinking about descendants, thinking about continuity, thinking about what should survive even if everything else disappears. Perhaps this explains why certain ideas endure longer than monuments. A monument can collapse. A useful lesson can survive indefinitely. A building can be destroyed. A story can travel across continents. Stone eventually breaks. Memory can continue. This may be one of history's greatest paradoxes. The most durable legacies are not always physical. Sometimes the most durable legacies exist inside minds, inside cultures, inside traditions, inside stories. And if that is true, then forgotten civilizations may have influenced the future far more than we realize. Their buildings disappeared, their names disappeared, yet their ideas continued traveling forward, quietly, patiently, generation after generation. Now let us consider another fascinating possibility. What if ancient people occasionally understood risks that modern people later rediscovered? This does not mean they possessed advanced technology. It does not mean they knew everything. Rather, it means careful observation sometimes reveals truths that remain relevant across centuries. For example, a community living beside a changing coastline may develop valuable knowledge about environmental adaptation. That knowledge becomes useful. Future generations preserve it. The original circumstances disappear. The lesson remains. Centuries later, people may no longer remember exactly why the lesson existed, yet they continue practicing it. The knowledge survives even after its origin becomes obscure. This phenomenon occurs surprisingly often in human history. A custom survives, a tradition survives, a belief survives. Only later do researchers discover practical reasons behind it. The tradition preserved information long after the original context was forgotten. This possibility makes cultural memory incredibly valuable, because hidden inside traditions may be observations accumulated across generations. Observations tested through experience, observations refined over time, observations worth preserving. And perhaps that brings us closer than ever to understanding the warning left by history's forgotten civilization. The warning may not have been a prediction. It may not have described one specific event. Instead, it may have described a process humanity experiences repeatedly. Change arrives, people respond. Adaptation determines outcomes. Memory improves adaptation. Forgetting weakens it. Simple, yet powerful. The more we examine human history, the more often this pattern appears. Civilizations thrive when knowledge accumulates. Civilizations struggle when valuable knowledge disappears. Learning matters, teaching matters, remembering matters. Perhaps these ideas sound obvious, but obvious lessons are often the easiest to overlook. Ancient people understood this, which is why they repeated important lessons again and again, through stories, through rituals, through traditions, through culture itself. Repetition preserved memory. Memory preserved knowledge. Knowledge improved survival. The cycle continued. Now let us imagine one final scene before we move deeper into the mystery. The sun is setting. A small group gathers near a fire. The day is ending. The stars begin appearing overhead. An elder speaks. Children listen. Adults listen. The story being told is older than anyone present, perhaps older than their grandparents, perhaps older than entire generations. The story describes change, loss, adaptation, survival. It reminds listeners that the world never remains exactly the same. It reminds listeners that knowledge matters. It reminds listeners that memory matters. Most importantly, it reminds listeners that every generation becomes responsible for carrying something forward, not wealth, not power, knowledge, experience, wisdom, the things future generations may need. As the story ends, the listeners do not realize they are participating in something extraordinary. They are becoming part of a chain stretching backward into the distant past, a chain stretching forward into an unknown future, a chain that may continue for thousands of years. And perhaps that chain is the true legacy of the civilization history forgot. Not a city, not a kingdom, not an empire, a chain of memory, a chain of observation, a chain of lessons carried across time. Yet our journey is far from over. Because the deeper we investigate these ancient echoes, the more evidence emerges that some forgotten societies may have preserved knowledge in ways we are only beginning to understand. And hidden within those methods may be the clearest clue yet about what their last survivors desperately hoped humanity would never forget. The longer we follow the trail of forgotten civilizations, the more we begin to understand that history is not simply a collection of dates and events. It is a conversation, a very long conversation, a conversation between people who never met one another, a conversation stretching across thousands of years. A farmer teaches a child, the child becomes an elder, the elder teaches another generation, that generation teaches the next, and slowly across centuries, knowledge moves forward. Most of the people participating in this conversation never know how important their role truly is. They simply share what they have learned. They pass along stories. They pass along warnings. They pass along experience. Yet without them, history would be impossible, because civilization is not built only from stone and wood. Civilization is built from memory. Imagine trying to create a society where every generation starts from the beginning. No inherited knowledge, no lessons from the past, no traditions, no stories, no accumulated experience. Progress would become almost impossible. Every generation would spend its life rediscovering what earlier generations already knew. Human civilization advances because memory advances. The present stands upon the knowledge of the past, and perhaps nowhere is this truth more visible than in the story of forgotten civilizations. Because even when their cities vanish, their influence sometimes remains. The influence becomes difficult to see, subtle, hidden, yet still present. A lesson survives, a practice survives, a story survives, a warning survives. The original civilization disappears, the message continues. This possibility becomes especially intriguing when we examine some of humanity's oldest traditions. Many ancient stories describe ancestors who possessed wisdom that later generations struggled to understand. The details vary from culture to culture, yet the pattern appears again and again. There was knowledge. Something happened. Part of that knowledge was lost. People remembered fragments. Future generations tried to reconstruct what remained. Perhaps these stories reflect a universal human experience. Every generation inherits incomplete knowledge. Every generation preserves some lessons and loses others. Every generation becomes both a guardian and a filter. Certain ideas survive. Certain ideas disappear. The process never stops. Now let us imagine a community standing at a turning point in history. The people may not realize it. Most turning points are only obvious in hindsight. To those living through them, life feels normal. The sun rises, people work, children grow, stories are told, everything seems familiar. Yet beneath the surface, profound changes are unfolding, trade routes are shifting, environmental conditions are evolving, new opportunities are emerging, new challenges are appearing, the future is quietly arriving, and some people notice. There are always observers, always individuals who pay attention to patterns. Individuals who notice small details before larger trends become obvious. In every age, these observers play a vital role. They become messengers, teachers, guardians of memory. The forgotten civilization may have depended upon such people, not rulers, not warriors, observers, people who watched carefully, people who understood that survival often begins with awareness. Awareness sounds simple, yet awareness requires effort. It requires patience. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to accept what reality is showing you rather than what you wish reality would show you. Ancient societies learned this lesson repeatedly. Nature rewarded observation. Nature punished carelessness. A community that ignored environmental signals could face serious consequences. A community that paid attention gained valuable time to prepare. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. Observation created understanding. Understanding improved survival. This relationship may explain why so many ancient traditions place such importance on listening. Listening to elders, listening to experience, listening to stories, listening to the land itself. Because listening is one of the ways knowledge moves through time. As time passes slowly, let us move deeper into a fascinating possibility. What if some forgotten civilizations were not destroyed by sudden disasters? What if they transformed? This idea challenges the way many people imagine history. We often think in terms of endings. A civilization rises, a civilization falls, the story ends. Reality is often more complicated. People move, cultures blend, traditions evolve, languages change, communities adapt. Sometimes a civilization disappears not because its people vanish, but because they become something new. The old identity fades. The descendants continue. The transformation becomes so gradual that later generations fail to recognize the connection. This possibility is important because it means fragments of forgotten civilizations may survive inside later cultures, not as complete systems, not as perfect copies, but as echoes, small pieces carried forward, a tradition here, a story there, a belief somewhere else. The original source becomes difficult to identify, yet the influence remains. Imagine a river flowing into a larger river. Eventually, the waters mix. The original stream becomes impossible to separate. Yet it still contributes to the whole. Human cultures often behave similarly. Ideas merge, traditions merge, knowledge merges. The result is a complex tapestry woven from countless earlier threads. Some threads remain visible, others disappear beneath the surface. Yet all contribute to the final pattern. This realization makes history feel deeper, richer, more interconnected. The forgotten civilization becomes less isolated, less alone. Instead, it becomes part of a much larger story. The story of humanity itself. A story filled with exchange, adaptation, learning, memory. Now let us consider another mystery. Why are people so fascinated by lost civilizations? Why do stories about forgotten cities and ancient mysteries continue capturing imaginations? Part of the answer may lie in what these stories reveal about ourselves. When we look at lost civilizations, we are not only looking backward, we are also looking inward. We see reflections of modern concerns, questions about change, questions about resilience, questions about what should be preserved, questions about what might be lost. Ancient civilizations remind us that no society is permanent. Every generation inherits responsibilities. Every generation makes choices. Every generation shapes the future. The forgotten civilization understood this, perhaps better than we realize. Because if their final survivors truly tried to leave a warning, that warning was likely intended for people facing uncertainty. Not one specific generation, all generations. The warning survives because uncertainty never disappears. Human circumstances change, technology changes, politics change, economies change. Yet uncertainty remains, and so the lesson remains useful. Observe carefully, learn continuously, adapt wisely, remember what matters. These ideas remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago, perhaps more relevant, because modern societies possess extraordinary power, extraordinary knowledge, extraordinary technology, yet none of these eliminate the need for wisdom. Knowledge tells us what can be done. Wisdom helps determine what should be done. Ancient communities understood this distinction. Experience taught it to them, generation after generation, story after story, lesson after lesson. And perhaps that wisdom forms the heart of their legacy. Not technical knowledge, not hidden inventions, not secret technologies. Wisdom, the ability to navigate change, the ability to recognize patterns, the ability to think beyond immediate concerns. Such wisdom rarely attracts headlines. It is quiet, patient, often overlooked. Yet history suggests it may be one of humanity's most valuable resources. Now imagine the final survivors once more. The world around them is changing. Some traditions are fading. Some communities are moving. The future feels uncertain. They cannot control everything that will happen. No generation can, but they can influence what is remembered. They can choose which lessons to preserve, which stories to tell, which warnings to repeat. And so they do, perhaps beside fires, perhaps during ceremonies, perhaps while traveling, perhaps while teaching children. The message continues moving forward. One generation passes it to the next. The next generation carries it further. Centuries pass, millennia pass. The original civilization disappears from memory, yet fragments of the message remain, enough fragments to reach us, enough fragments to make us curious, enough fragments to encourage questions. And questions are powerful things. Questions drive exploration. Questions drive learning. Questions drive discovery. Without questions, history becomes static. With questions, history remains alive. Every archaeological discovery begins with a question. Every historical investigation begins with a question. Every search for forgotten civilizations begins with a question. And perhaps the most important question in our story is this: what were those final survivors truly trying to protect? The answer may not be a place. It may not be an object. It may not even be a specific piece of information. The answer may be something much larger, a way of seeing the world, a way of thinking about change, a way of understanding humanity's relationship with time, memory, and survival. And as we continue our journey, we will move closer to that possibility. Because hidden within the echoes of forgotten civilizations lies an idea so simple that it is often overlooked. Yet it may explain why their message survived at all. A simple idea about memory, about knowledge, and about the responsibility every generation carries toward the future. And so, as our long journey through the forgotten corridors of history begins to slow, we arrive at a surprising realization. The civilization history forgot may never have been forgotten entirely. Its cities may be gone, its buildings may have returned to dust, its language may have faded into silence, its people may no longer have names we can remember, yet something survived, something far more difficult to destroy than stone. An idea, a lesson, a way of understanding the world. Throughout our journey, we searched for a lost civilization. We searched for monuments, for clues, for evidence, for answers. And along the way, we discovered that the most important things ancient people left behind were often invisible. Not walls, not treasures, not empires, memory, observation, wisdom. The final survivors may never have known whether their message would endure. They could not see the distant future. They could not imagine the modern world. They could not know who would one day hear their story. Yet they continued teaching. They continued observing. They continued preserving what they believed mattered. And perhaps that is why their legacy survived. Not because it was written in stone, but because it was written into human experience itself. Again and again, across thousands of years, humanity encountered change. Again and again, people adapted. Again and again, communities learned lessons, passed them forward, and hoped future generations would listen. The forgotten civilization was simply one chapter in that much larger story, a chapter that reminds us of something deeply important. No civilization lasts forever. No empire remains unchanged. No generation keeps every piece of knowledge. Yet each generation has the opportunity to carry something valuable forward. A lesson, a story, a warning, an observation. A piece of wisdom that might help someone in the future. Perhaps that was the true warning the last survivors tried to leave behind. Not a warning about one disaster, not a warning about one place, a warning against forgetting. Forgetting what earlier generations learned. Forgetting the importance of observation. Forgetting the value of memory. Forgetting the connection between people and the world around them. Because history suggests that when memory fades completely, humanity must learn the same lessons again. And when memory survives, even imperfectly, the future gains a small advantage. a small guide, a small light, a small reminder from those who came before. As we sit here tonight, separated from those ancient people by thousands of years, it is easy to focus on the differences between their world and ours. Yet perhaps the similarities matter more. They wondered about the future. We wonder about the future. They faced uncertainty. We face uncertainty. They searched for understanding. We search for understanding. And just like them, we leave pieces of ourselves behind for generations we will never meet. In that way, the conversation never truly ends. It simply continues. One generation speaking softly to the next, across centuries, across civilizations, across time itself. And somewhere in that endless conversation, the voices of history's forgotten people still remain. Quiet, patient, almost impossible to hear, yet not completely silent, still reminding us to observe, to learn, to remember, and perhaps above all else to never stop being curious. Now, as the night grows deeper and the ancient world slowly fades back into the shadows of time, you can let your mind rest. The ruins become silent once more. The distant fires burn low. The storytellers finish their final words. The stars continue their slow journey across the sky. And the forgotten civilization, having shared its last message, drifts gently back into history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the mysteries of the ancient world. Until our next story, rest well, and good night.